Hi everyone, it's Louise Pearson back with another video. And for those of you who haven't heard my other videos, I'm speaking to you as a counsellor, a grief and bereavement counsellor, and a social worker, and also someone who has lived experience of a life-limiting illness, which currently is pancreatic cancer. And I'm, I guess, wanting to address with you the topic of it being a grief process when you have something like a life-limiting illness. And I'm wanting to address this because I find that there's very little out here about when you're the one with the illness and the grief that you experience. I found a course called How to Mourn Your Own Death, a course in dying, but not particularly wanting to study dying, I don't suppose. I didn't find there was a lot of useful resources for us who are grieving our own mortality rather than as a person who is bereaved. So I guess my thoughts, and these are not research based necessarily, although I am a grief counsellor, I'm not wanting to speak to you from that place. I'm speaking more as a person with lived experience. Grief is a normal response to knowing you have a life-limiting illness. I think that probably disbelief and fear are huge emotions that we all experience, but grief is with you for the whole journey. When you're first diagnosed, you experience a huge amount of grief about what life would have been, what you were planning for, whether you'll get there. Uncertainty arrives along with fear and that lovely disbelief, and with it all comes grief. And it can hit you in waves. You might be fine for hours or days at a time even as you go on through the process. But something changes. You experience some new symptoms. You find that something is, you're getting a treatment update. You're getting some scans and experiencing what someone from the council mentioned to me as scanxiety. And the grief can come right back. You can be triggered by the words of a song, the knowledge that there's a big event coming up in your life and you're wondering if you'll be there. And I guess the main thing I want to say is that these responses are normal. So as a grief counsellor, what I find that can be helpful to do is to work with some models of grief. And I guess I'm just bringing those to your attention to see if they help you at all as you try and understand your grief process. So there's the 5 stages model made very famous by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and actually for people who are dying. She talks about people going through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally coming to acceptance. But she did also acknowledge that people moved around those stages. And it's been very well documented, her work, but I guess for myself, I haven't found it as useful in this process. So I go on to another model, which is the dual process of grief. And that was brought out by Strobe and Schutt in the 90s for people who were grieving for a bereavement or after a bereavement. But I think it can be useful for people who have life-limiting illnesses as well. And with their model, they suggest that people are using a process which is a bit like a pendulum swinging, really, from loss-oriented tasks on one side to restoration-oriented tasks on the other. And with your loss-oriented, that can be things like doing lots of crying and being sad and thinking about the things that you're missing or that you're not able to do anymore, or the uncertainty that's moved in. It can also be being around people and doing some of that sort of stuff with people. With the restoration oriented tasks, they're more things like they can be planning for your worst case scenario, looking at what you want to do if you die, what sorts of things you want to set up. And I'm going to talk about that in another video. But it can also be doing things from your general ordinary life that you did pre-illness, which might be cooking dinner for friends, planning events, going back to work, those sorts of things. Another model which can be helpful is the Growing Around Grief model, which is from Lois Tonkin. And she starts off with the idea that the premise that we have about time healing all wounds is not actually correct. She says that once you've experienced a grief, and I can relate to this with uncertainty, it doesn't go away. It doesn't even diminish in size, is her thinking. But what happens as we go on and we do different things and we expand our networks or go on with life in some way, shape or form, we actually find that the area of our lives that particular grief takes up is not necessarily as big as it was in the beginning, not quite so figural. But what I like about that is the suggestion that it doesn't go away, and I think that's the truth. Finally, some Australian women, Schultz and Bruce, did or came up with a model for non-finite loss and grief. And I think that's very relevant to the situation that we're talking about here, because they talked about the fact that, with an illness, it doesn't stop with diagnosis. It doesn't stop with one death, for example, as it might in bereavement. It's lots of things that are piling up. So you first grief around diagnosis, then you might experience some symptoms, or you might be less able to do things. You might have to leave work, these sorts of things. And so all of those little things that add up become new grief, and the grief is non-finite. So I guess I just wanted to introduce those models to give you some sort of framework to think about the way that you're grieving. Think about if any of them fit you, and they may or may not, but I have included there a link to the Funeral Guide Australia, and I've done that when there could have been so many other websites to link to, because I think it's got a simple explanation of those models. So, as I mentioned with those models, it's about what works for you. The important point to take away from all of this is something that you already know, perhaps, and that is that the grief process can be exhausting. So be kind to yourself. Do what you need to do to get you through it, and accept that some days you're going to have more energy. Like I said, I use the dual process model a little bit, and so some days I'm going to have loss-oriented days, and other days I'm going to have restoration-oriented days where I don't think about it as much. I guess the other point is that other people around you, those in your networks, those who love you, are also grieving. And it can help to understand that we all grieve differently, which is going to be the subject of my next video. Have a check and see if your practiced coping strategies are helpful to you. Things like writing or music, doing puzzles, taking time out, whatever it is that once worked for you, because they mightn't work all of the time, but they still will work some of the time. And most importantly, remember that you're not alone. There's lots of support out there, from support groups that you can meet with people face to face, to going to see a counsellor, to Facebook groups. This is a subject we could go on about for days. Grief has been one of the loves of my life, grief and bereavement, and now grief around chronic illness. If you found this helpful, please subscribe to my channel or visit my website, which is www.louisepearson.com.au, and I'll be back with more videos for you from the front line, from someone who is experiencing some of the same things that you are if you have a life-limiting illness.